Good day. I'm Johan Coetzee, and I would like to talk about corruption, various manifestations of corruption, what is corruption, common descriptions about corruption, and many other. So what follows is a series of videos about corruption. I'm very passionate about studying corruption. Now, corruption is from different perspectives and different angles and different lenses one can look at corruption. I think that's important to realize, trying to understand the systemic nature and complexity of corruption. It is a global trend of corruption. Yeah. And there are also counter trends. So it's difficult to say if corruption is increasing or decreasing. However, let's look at corruption from different perspectives so that we can come to a multi-subject, multi-perspective, transnational approach towards what corruption is, what does it entail in different countries. Of course, corruption also differs in context. Corruption in Russia is not the same as corruption in the United States of America. So I will not try to bore you with definitions and descriptions of corruption, and as I go on, I will later then to refer to what actually corruption is. However, in order to start off with what is corruption, most common definition and descriptions defined by the World Bank originally said that corruption is the abuse of public office for private gain. And later the World Bank realized, but it's not only about the public service or government that's accountable for corruption, but also the private sector, also NGOs, also civil society overlooking corruption. And then they changed their definition of 2019, the World Bank, towards the abuse of trust office for personal gain. There are hundreds and thousands of definitions about corruption, and where the most important is not necessarily to find the most appropriate definition of corruption, but first to look at what is corruption in order to describe corruption. And because corruption is ever mutating, and one is not able to define corruption in absolute terms, as one would try to do in lawmaking. So, from a legal perspective, every country's definition or description of corruption in terms of anti-corruption legislation can differ, and rightly so, because the society also differ. So the legal perspective about what is corruption and what's being defined will always differ from the much broader understanding of what corruption is, because if you work with the law, then you need specific boundaries. What is corruption in order to be very specific and technical about what it is corruption. That is one of the problems with corruption, that you cannot define corruption in terms of only legal terms. Because corruption is not based on today. It's an ever-evolving, mutating, what we can call disease or a virus. So corruption is a concept. It is a concept that is direct in line or opposing integrity. And the word integrity comes from the Latin word integer, meaning to look at the whole. So corruption is the opposite of integrity, and the antithesis of integrity, and that means to break the wholeness of something. Corruption is also in association with the Latin word rompere, that means to break. So mean to break the wholeness of something, to depart from its original. If you refer to a system in terms of systemic terms. Now, one can argue about what is the original purpose of a system. But the main point remains that corruption breaks down the wholeness, the balance of a system, of any system, financial system, economic system, society as a system, an institution as a system, country as a system, for example. Now, the Greek word ethos, from that the English word ethics is also coming from, and ethos in Greek means character. So to bring it in line with integrity and rompere, that means to break, it means that corruption is breaking the wholeness of a character, of the character of a person. And that's why ethics is referring to personal values, where morality in civil terms refer more to the values of a group, what we call group behavior in terms of sociology. So one can say that corruption impairs the integrity, and it breaks down the original purpose of a system, of a person, of the character of a person, that is impacting negatively on society, because it's not to the benefit of society, but only in interest of a person or a small group of people, or friends or relatives, or a political party, what we call patronage. Corruption is one of the most common forms, is bribery. And later on, I will make a video about the different manifestations of corruption, of which there are hundreds of different manifestations of corruption, ever mutating. So, just to summarize, one can say that corruption is a concept. Corruption is a systemic concept because it meets the requirements of being systemic. That means one cannot solve corruption based on a linear approach. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. You cannot just increase policing and increasing more stronger legislation, and then you will think you will solve corruption. Because corruption doesn't depend on factors. It is not linear. You cannot express it in absolute terms. And therefore, corruption is a systemic concept consisting of millions of variables, like the economy, like development, like poverty, that are also systemic terms. Corruption is also a complex concept because it has got negative recurring loops. You've heard about the expression corruption strengthens corruption. Corruption also creates its own environment. That means that a small group of people that are based in a network create their own values, their own culture, their own principles, their own behavior. And that means that corruption creates its own culture or its own environment, and it shapes its own environment, and it's ever mutating. So one can say corruption is a concept. Corruption is a systemic concept consisting of millions of variables, and there are many other characteristics or elements of systemic concepts which corruption comply with. And then corruption is also a complex concept. One can also say that corruption is a system, and it's very important to understand why corruption is a system, because we get many systems, as I've explained already. So corruption is a concept. It's a systemic concept. It's a complex systemic concept. corruption is ever mutating. Then corruption has got an impact on other systemic concepts like poverty. So corruption can increase poverty and vice versa. Corruption undermines development. That is another systemic concept. And underdevelopment also undermines or increase corruption. So corruption is definitely also an impact. It's got a negative impact. It also got a positive impact for the small group of people that benefit from it and then can become dependent on it. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult not to eliminate, because corruption can never be eliminated. It can, like prostitution, it can only be reduced or minimized. Like in South Korea, they have a target of limiting corruption to about 5%, which is a realistic concept, taking into account that men are born good and evil. So it is corruption is also a cancer, and a cancer of the morality of society. As Beyers Nadia, one of the anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, said that if a society is losing its soul through corruption, then it can be very devastating for any society. So corruption has got to do with morality, but it's not only limited to morality. Corruption has got many different co-producers, what we call in systemic terms, and not factors that are limited in absolute terms with absolute boundaries. And corruption cannot be analyzed, because a linear concept you can analyze, and then you can put it together and take it apart. But corruption, with so many variables of which we still don't know today to what extent the different variables interact into a system and becomes interdependent on each other. Therefore, one cannot develop a strategy, an approach, a blueprint for corruption. One can try to manage corruption as far as possible. But corruption is like a cat. You cannot manage corruption because it depends on so many variables. Just like the climate that cannot be predicted, because there are so many variables that not any model can model the climate, not even the weather for more than 6 hours. A pilot cannot fly about weather predictions of today longer than 6 hours. That means that we cannot predict the weather for tomorrow or even the day after that. So and therefore we cannot predict the climate change for the next 50 years. If we cannot even predict the weather for the next day, then which pilots cannot fly. The similar idea or narrative is that we cannot predict corruption because there are too many variables that we still don't understand. Similar to the climate, because the climate depends on soil types, rainfall, topography, wind, the sea, the different ocean streams in the sea, and it depends on the amount of CO2. Although the CO2 is just a very small contributor, it also depends on many other variables that cannot be determined. That is similar to corruption. So one can say that corruption is a concept. It is also a systemic concept. It is a complex, systemic concept. It is a virus like cancer. It can be also be a virus of lifestyle. because sometimes cancer can also cause, or the lifestyle of a person can also contribute to diseases like diabetes and cancer. And I don't want to offend anybody that having cancer being associated with corruption. In this case, I just want to use that as an example of a virus of the mind and of cancer, of which people can die, but of which the cures actually exist, on which I will also elaborate on in videos that follow. So one can also compare corruption with HIV/AIDS, and here I also don't want to offend people living with HIV/AIDS that have attracted HIV/AIDS in many different forms, and sometimes just through blood transfusion, for example. So a country can die from corruption; it can collapse, to put it in that terms. So it is possible to say that corruption have got contributors, has got the impact, and it also impact on other concepts and other problems. And corruption, because it's a systemic term, it's not just a problem, it's not just a challenge, but it's a problem situation consisting of many sets of problems. So in order to address or to reduce corruption, one has to look at systems, financial system, economic systems, leadership systems, political systems, what motivates people. One has to look at the reward systems and also systems to punish corrupt behavior. So one also has to look at laws that is not actually encouraging trying to fight corruption, but actually encouraging them with absolute sentences that is maximized, which cannot reduce corruption, because once one passes the threshold of a maximum sentence, and the benefits are more than the disadvantages or the scandal or the penalties or the conviction in the court, people will go for corruption because of the high rewards for corruption. So with this, I would like to conclude this first video about corruption by saying that corruption is also a pathology. It's also a disease. And it is a disease of the mind. And as we know that everything starts with, in a person's mind, greed, for example, jealousy, resentment. And what is in one's mind also then further leads to thoughts. As we develop thoughts, we also put it into practice in terms of actions and in terms of behavior, and then it becomes a repetitive behavior, what we call a character. So if we are repeatedly greedy and selfish and jealous and have a resentment towards people in society and being judgmental, that will then become part of your character or viciousness. And by that, I will conclude then this first video. I hope you understand now corruption better in terms of different dimensions of at the pathology or disease, with many different aspects to it, and ever mutating as new forms of corruption develop, like cybercrime, for example. Thank you very much.